Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Guillermo Martinez, Deputy Director and International Intergovernmental Liaison at the SUNY Institute of Immigrant Integration, Research and Policy. We're excited to have you join us today in the presentation by our fellows on immigrant integration at the Institute of Immigrant Integration, Research and Policy. They're a dynamic group of scholars from SUNY and CUNY that combine, speak 8 languages, and bring a host of talents and international perspectives to their research. We meet today at an opportune time. National and state headlines are dominated by immigration issues, and New York has become the center of related discussions. At the Institute of Immigrant Integration, Research and Policy, we are focused on advancing the knowledge on immigrant integration and promoting responsive policies and practices to narrow the social, economic, and political participation gaps between native-born and immigrants. This forum is only part of the work we have begun since operation began early this year. We're working to provide research and policy proposals to help immigrants better integrate into the receiving communities by helping policymakers and practitioners accelerate adoption of promising practices and to stimulate responsive policy that reduce the cost of integrating immigrants. Overall, our work will improve the quality of outcome for foreign New Yorkers and will benefit all New Yorkers. The work of the Institute on Immigrant Integration is made possible by the strong support of the New York State Assembly majority and thanks to the leadership of a dynamic group of lawmakers, Assemblywoman Catalina Cruz and Assemblywoman Sarah Safran Forrest, the former and current chairs of the Assembly Task Force on New Americans, and Assemblywoman Karina Reyes, chair of the Assembly Puerto Rican Hispanic Task Force. The strong support of the SUNY Board of Trustees is also important to note. Under the leadership of Board Vice Chair Cesar Perales and Trustee Marcos Crespo, the Institute has become a reality. This strong leadership comes at a time when our federal government now projects that beginning in 2042, all of the population growth in the United States will be due to immigration, as birth rates continue to significantly decline. This is one statistic that now frames the demographic changes and opportunities that face our nation and our state. So here now and under the strong leadership, we in New York can now better prepare to lead the nation on issues of immigrant integration and to lead on issues of building our human capital to maintain our global economic strength. At this very important time in the nation's history, we are fortunate to have at the helm of the Rockefeller Institute of Government the most knowledgeable individual on state government and finance anywhere in state government. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the former New York State Budget Director and President of the Rockefeller Institute of Government, Robert Magna, Officer of SUNY System Administration. In that role, he oversaw the operations of the Chief Communications Officer, the State University of New York Plaza business functions, capital facilities, campus energy management, and the Charter School Institute. Bob served as the Budget Director for the New York State Division of the Budget, during which time the state achieved its highest financial rating in 40 years. Bob Magna has served as Commissioner of the New York State Department of Tax and Finance, Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Tax Policy at the Virginia Department of Taxation, and Director of the Tax Studies at the State Department of Tax and Finance. He recently returned to the Rockefeller Institute after being asked by Governor Hochul to return to the Division of the Budget to help craft this year's state budget. Bob earned his master's in science and economics from the London School of Economics and political science at the University of London and received his BA in economics and MPA from Fordham Universities. Bob, the mic is all yours. Thank you.
Guillermo, thank you, but it's not about me at all today, so thank you. It's about you and about Professor Rifke and the fine work of these students. I want to welcome you to what is essentially an inaugural event of the Institute. And the initiative that was, as Guillermo talked about, established in the legislature, supported by the governor, and is about an increasingly interconnected and diverse world. The role of immigrants in shaping our economies, fostering innovation, and enriching societies cannot be understated. You know, sometimes I think coming, as a second generation American myself, that a lot of New Yorkers forget their history and forget the fact that this has always been a state of immigrants and immigration and bringing new Americans into the country who become successful and contributors to society. And I think sometimes we forget that, especially now where, given our current migrant situation, our world has gotten ever more relevant to policymakers, how we deal with the integration of migrants into our society. But we're honored today to have a diverse and engaged audience with us. It includes policymakers, academic practitioners, members of the media, and others who care about this issue. You know, as part of today's webinar, you will hear from our first cohort of integration fellows, which is probably the key to today. And unlike me and the rest of the kind of supporting administration, these are the key folks who are doing actual study into the problems confronting the migrant community and the questions of immigration that we face. Before we go on, I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of the Institute of Immigration Integration, Dr. Dina Refke. I've gotten to know her a little bit, and she's made huge contributions in this field. She serves as the Director of Women in Government and Civil Society at the University of Albany. She is ably assisted by Guillermo Martinez, who, again, spent a lot of time introducing me, but probably should have spent a little bit more time introducing himself to this group. He has an enormous amount of experience in this area, and we're glad to have him here at the Rockefeller Institute. Dr. Refke has dedicated her career to the studying the challenges of migration, the barriers facing immigrant women and their families, and the structural changes needed to better respond to the needs of immigrants. I think I want to hear from our folks today more than I want to hear myself talk, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Refke. But you're on mute, Dr. Refke, so we got to get you off that first.
Apologies about that. Thank you, Director Magna, for your remarks. We truly appreciate your leadership and are really fortunate to have your unwavering support of the Institute's work. It is my pleasure now to briefly introduce New York State Secretary of State Robert Rodriguez. Secretary of State Rodriguez is a uniquely accomplished leader and former legislator with civic and legislative successes that have been focused strategically on investing in and developing public good infrastructure projects, creating good paying jobs, and addressing financial disparities for historically underrepresented populations. As a legislator, Mr. Rodriguez served as a member of the New York State Assembly, and during his time, he focused on protecting and creating affordable housing, bringing good jobs to the community, and ensuring children received quality education. He also held several positions in the private sector, including Director of Public Financial Management, the leading municipal financial advisor. He also served on a number of community boards, and he is genuinely a civic leader who cares about vulnerable communities. I would like to welcome Secretary Rodriguez, who will share with us some recorded remarks. Secretary Rodriguez.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be with you. I'm Secretary of State Robert Rodriguez, and I want to start out by thanking Dr. Dina Refke for inviting me to talk about such an important issue, an issue that is currently dominating the headlines, sparking calls for action and invoking discussions in communities all across New York State. New York has always been a welcoming state. In fact, the symbol of freedom and liberty stands in our waters. The Statue of Liberty is a beacon to all immigrants all over the world looking for a better life. And it's one of the reasons Governor Hochul launched the New York State Institute for Immigration Integration Research and Policy. I'm proud to acknowledge that our own Executive Director of the Office of New Americans, Dr. Laura Gonzalez-Murphy, serves on the advisory board. At the Department of State, we have been at the forefront of helping immigrant communities integrate into our society for the past decade. Over 10 years ago, New York State founded the Office for New Americans, which is overseen by the Department of State. It was the first in the nation created by statute in the state legislature. And since then, the Office of New Americans and our community-based partners have assisted over 700,000 immigrants. We've recently doubled our ONA staff, and the number of grants has grown from 37 in the beginning to over 100 today. We have created nearly 40 opportunity centers across the state, with some providing English classes with a workforce development component, and other centers that focus on civics, providing naturalization support and legal consultations. We've expanded our programming over time to include mental health supports and empowering new Americans with disabilities as they face additional barriers. These programs are important because we all know how difficult it can be navigating the myriad of government services. And we're just talking about for those of us who have lived here our whole lives. Imagine the daunting task of coming to a new country and trying to figure it out alone in another language, let alone not even speaking any other language. In recognition of ONA's important contributions as a key agency serving immigrants over the past 10 years, the governor and the legislature increased state funding by an additional $43 million, bringing our total operating budget to $63 million. They recognize the need is still there and that we need to support and expand our services to immigrants. These additional funds will expand the capacity of legal service providers across the state to respond to the needs of new asylum seekers, as well as to continue our core programming. But the numbers don't tell the story, not the whole story. The impact and the key contributions this office has had over the past 10 years have been truly significant. Let me give you a few real-life examples. I was recently in Syracuse, where I met several inspiring individuals who made their way to this country in search of a better life. So the first story, an individual from the country of Sudan. He came here speaking no English. He went to one of our opportunity centers where he was placed in a language class and learned English. Then he got a job at a local hotel, and during that time he studied to become a US citizen and recently took his oath of citizenship. And just a few weeks ago, he bought a house. He was beaming with pride as he told us a story, and while it's certainly beneficial for him, it's also a win for the community. He's contributing to the local economy and the tax base and bringing his culture. But wait, it gets even better. He felt compelled to pay it forward. He went back to where he started and got a job at the Opportunity Center, and now is serving as a shining example of what can be accomplished. He's helping others make a life for themselves and their families, just like he did. I heard countless stories. The school teacher from South Africa who's now contributing to a future as a teacher's aide in the local school district, the engineer from Afghanistan who did not want to come to this country and drive an Uber, but wanted to work in the career he studied for back in his homeland. And now he's working as an engineer in New York State. And companies across the state appreciate and value diversity. For example, late last year, Governor Hochul announced that Micron, a computer chip company, is coming to Central New York and bringing 50,000 jobs. The CEO is quoted as saying they chose the location for many reasons, but most importantly, that Central New York offers a rich pool of diverse talent, including communities that have traditionally been underrepresented in technology jobs. This company is known for its belief in embracing diversity within its organization because they know that having a multicultural community means to their business. They know the importance of having varied perspectives and how those perspectives can lead to innovative thinking. And through one of ONA's workforce support programs, it's called Professional Pathways, we are not only assisting immigrants gain employment in their areas of interest and training them as we did with the school teacher and the engineer, but we are ensuring our employers are supported with committed and qualified workers. Let me give you another example of the Department of State and our role. One of our cornerstone economic development programs is the Downtown Revitalization Initiative, or we call it DRI. This program helps bring downtowns back to life. So as communities redevelop their plans for reviving their downtowns, they look at several components, including redevelopment, job creation, and economic and housing diversity. I've toured many of these communities, and I have found that the most successful DRI towns are the ones that have embraced cultural diversity in their plans. All across New York, new Americans are driving the economic growth in their communities, not just by being employees, but by starting small businesses and contributing to the state and local taxes. The more we help the immigrant community integrate into society, the better New York State will be. That has been the goal of the Office for New Americans for over the years, connecting individuals to the vital services that are needed to succeed, to feel empowered, to feel connected to one's community, and to add to the cultural fabric that is New York State. Immigrants who succeed here contribute to the economic and social prosperity of all communities, and that helps benefit all of us. So in conclusion, we're very proud of the work that we have done to help immigrants navigate through the governmental process, assist them with the pathways to rewarding careers and helping them to become new New Yorkers. So I look forward to working with you and following the progress of this esteemed group as you help define policy so that everyone can access the New York dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Rodriguez. We are incredibly proud to be New Yorkers, where we have a government that values immigrants and work to provide them with opportunities. Why should we care about harnessing the economic contributions of immigrants? Because according to the US Census, the nation has experienced a historic decline in the population between 2020 and 2021. Obviously, the pandemic had contributed to this decline, but New York State had the largest numeric and percentage decline in population. It ranked first in the top 10 states in the numeric decline from 2021 to 2022, losing 0.9% of its population. Yes, we experienced a rebound in 2022, driven by a return to pre-pandemic levels of immigration and increase in total births. But why should we care about population loss and population decline in the US? Because it affects all of us. When we have declining fertility rates, fewer new births, and the population continues to age, we have ultimately fewer working age adults. So the economy slows down, and we are not able to support the increasing number of retirees who are reliant on public funded pensions, caregiving, and healthcare. If we continue to have rapidly growing elderly population and a shrinking working age adult population, we have an imbalance and are placing pressure on the retirement and healthcare system. The US Census projects that by 2035, if the trend continues, the population age 65 and over will be greater than the population under 18 years of age. Immigrants provide a source of workers that can bring balance and mitigate the storm of low birth rates and population decline. Migration increases the labor force growth in the US and in other countries that are experiencing similar trends, because immigrants contribute additional skills and talents, and because we have studies that have documented the contributions to innovations by pointing out the large share of patent filing and share in science and technology fields that immigrants bring. Immigrants' labor force participation was also found to increase occupational specialization, contribute to economic productivity, and of course, contribute to the tax base in communities. Although studies have documented the large economic contributions that immigrants make to the US economy, which was estimated in one study to be around $2 trillion in 2016, observers have indicated that as a nation, we have not fully harnessed the potential of immigration. We are experiencing a talent gap labor force shortages, and challenges in filling critical occupations that are integral to maintaining our global competitiveness. Several studies indicated that employers have a hard time filling available jobs. There's a need to reform the occupational licensing and credentialing so that regulations do not stifle recruitment and hiring of workers and incentivize workers from entering or staying in occupations. And so we have a cohort, our first cohort of fellows on immigrant integration. And the first presentation you'll hear from them, Ken Silverman's presentation, will tackle the challenges of brain waste facing immigrants with foreign obtained degrees who seek to work in occupations for which they have been trained, but face bureaucratic and financial hurdles that force them into occupations that do not leverage the skills and talents they have. Ken also offers recommendations to reform the system so we can harness those talents and employ them toward serving the economic labor force needs that we have. Skilling and workforce development that are directly tied to our regional workforce demands are needed, but mainstream workforce development programs often fail to realize that a one-size-fits-all approach does not address the unique challenges facing newcomers. Joaquin Sanchez Gomez's presentation will address workforce development needs of immigrants and will offer recommendations to mainstream immigrant workers' considerations into existing systems so they are more responsive to those needs, those unique needs that they don't share with their native-born counterparts, and would better prepare immigrants for the workforce. Immigrants are more likely than their native-born counterparts to establish businesses and to engage in entrepreneurship. But they also face unique barriers and challenges that are not faced by their native-born counterparts in their quest to access banking, loans, and capital. So Asha Venugopalan presentation analyzes the challenges and offer recommendations to mobilize and activate that potential more productively as an economic development strategy. There's no doubt that government cannot do it alone. So harnessing the economic potential of immigrants requires cross-sector partnerships and collaborative efforts that involve many actors, including the public, private, and nonprofit sector, and engages educational institutions, employers, consortia that work together to advance economic and social integration of immigrants. Everyone has to contribute to that effort. So Shin's presentation takes a closer look at partnership models and at how these partnership models can be strengthened. Tsveta Dobreva's presentation delves deep into the role of higher educational institutions in preparing the immigrant workforce and meeting workforce demands. Tsveta's presentation analyzes the challenges facing immigrants and institutions in providing unhindered access and unpacks promising models that have carved paths to address these challenges successfully and holistically. The fellow's work has relied on extensive reviews of literature and in-depth interviews with key stakeholders to collect and synthesize data on existing challenges and ways and approaches in harnessing the power of the economic contributions of immigrants. Without any further ado, it is my pleasure to provide the floor to the fellows and their presentations. And after their presentation, we will engage with the fellows in a moderated discussion, then open the floor for dialogue with the participants. So our first presenter is Ken Silverman. Ken, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Refke. Hopefully you can see my screen here. Okay, excellent. So my name is Ken Silverman, and I'll be presenting on foreign credential recognition policy models and discussing some of their challenges and recommendations. So before I begin, I just want to first sort of discuss what is meant by migrant de-skilling. It's essentially when you have a mismatch between migrants' professional qualifications or the formal training that they acquired in their country of origin and the type of employment that they're able to have in the host or receiving country. And the stereotypical example is, as Secretary Rodriguez was discussing, is when you have an overeducated, say, taxi or rideshare driver who is formerly a doctor or some other highly skilled professional in their home country, but they're unable to leverage these skills in the host country. Now, what happens is, sending countries are not only losing the skills that the migrant takes with them, right, which is also known as brain drain, but these skills are often not being used in the receiving country, hence the term brain waste, right? So it's difficult to put a numerical figure on this loss of skills, but one figure that I saw out of Queensland, Australia, which has about the same population as Colorado, was an estimated loss of 250 million in gross state product over a 10-year period. Moreover, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've also seen that the shortage of skilled work, especially in healthcare and other sectors, is a serious problem in the US and elsewhere. So this is not only an economic question, but it's also one that concerns, public health, even national security. And so the chart that I have here shows that it's not only about underemployment, it's also about unemployment. So this chart is from an OECD report, which is comparing unemployment rates among highly educated foreign-born versus native-born in 33 countries. And as you can see, in almost all of them, except for about 2, these countries fall below the line that says equal, the gray line. So what it means is there's a higher unemployment rate among the foreign-born, highly educated foreign-born than native-born. And this is across the industrialized world. I've circled the US in yellow, so you can see it's kind of in the middle of the pack. But this is not a problem unique to the US or New York, but it is certainly an area where New York can hopefully lead someday. Next, I wanted to kind of discuss the main barriers to reskilling. And the first one is information asymmetry. Basically, what this refers to is the uncertainty that employers have about a migrant's skill transferability. And as a result, often have to rely on proxy characteristics. And this ties into the second barrier, which is discrimination, bias, and other normative perceptions of foreign countries in general. And this is one of the things that we've seen in the age of migration, right, is that there's a deeper divide of inequalities between countries, especially sending countries, which tend to south and the receiving. The third barrier is what's known as professional protectionism. This is really just the tendency of regulated fields to give preference to native-born or educated workers through professional associations and networks, which can be very difficult for migrants to penetrate. Okay, so what are the main policy models? I've divided them into 3 categories based on their different dimensions. The first one are basically unilateral programs that are implemented in the receiving countries. These are known generally as bridging programs. And a key aspect of bridging programs that I wanted to highlight, as the other presenters will be talking about, is including other stakeholders, in this case, employers, right? As one of my informants told me, bridging programs can be very effective, but you need to build a bridge to somewhere, meaning you need to have a landing spot on the other side of the training and upskilling process for the migrant. The second model is what's known as pre-migration programs. This generally involves training and skills transferability, but it's done before the migrant arrives in the receiving country. So obviously, it requires a lot more coordination between governments and other institutions. And the third model is what's known as mutual recognition agreements, or MRAs. These are typically formal agreements between governments or regulatory bodies, and they can apply to entire professional fields. And the goal of having MRAs is it's supposed to provide confidence in foreign obtained degrees established at higher levels of governance among countries so that you don't have to assess migrant skills on an individual basis, which can often lead to problems around discrimination and bias. And then below that, I've listed some of the impact examples from these three policy models from Germany, Australia, and EU. So these, there are still many challenges in this area, clearly, that, a lot of these models don't necessarily address. A large one, a main structural issue is with refugee resettlement, right? And the fact that refugee resettlement programs oftentimes are mandating immediate economic independence among refugees. And what this does is incentivizes refugees to search for so-called survival employment, which basically means that they're not able to leverage the skills or education that they may bring with them. They're just trying to get any job as quickly as possible. Another remaining challenge is that there are still latent biases, and we see this in not only hiring, but also in promotions, right? Foreign-born women still lag behind foreign-born men in terms of labor integration rates, and immigrants still make up a disproportionately smaller share of senior level positions in many companies. So promotions is still an area that needs work. And of course, another issue is that entry into many regulated fields still require licenses with legal restrictions around citizenship, which brings me to, lastly, recommendations. No, it's an exhaustive list, but just these are kind of the top four that I've been hearing about and reading about through my research. So one principal issue that we've heard from stakeholders is the need to address the sheer difficulty of navigating the system, which can often be fragmented, right, in order to get your skills or credentials recognized. And because every state is different and the rules often differ by industry, a first step could be for states to create sort of a one-stop, user-friendly online information source where newcomers can go and hopefully it could be in other languages, right, to help them navigate the process. Another recommendation would be that states don't have to wait for the federal government to take action, or the national government in other countries, right? States, universities, other institutions can start working on agreements with other governments and universities in other countries to start standardizing credential recognition. This is already growing, but it's certainly a trend that needs to continue and expand. Another issue that came up a lot is the need to involve employers, right? We're talking about other stakeholders, future policy making, because ultimately it is going to take buy-in from employers in order to boost labor integration rates. And lastly, for New York State, passing the Empire State Licensing Act in next year's legislative session would be a great first step. Similar bills have been passed in other states in recent years, and it would basically remove the citizenship requirement for certain regulated professions, and this would be a great first step to take. And then here are some statistical sources I can provide to others if you're interested later on, but that is all, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ken. We move on to Joaquin Sanchez Gomez. Joaquin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. One of the most rewarded joys has been on this fellowship has been to meet Dr. Refki, Guillermo, and to share the floor with Ken, Tsveta, Soshee, and Asha. So it is a pleasure for me today. I'm gonna talk about workforce development policies for immigrants. And well, so why is it important to have workforce development policies for immigrants? According to the ILO, 5 out of 10 migrants are economically active. Even those who migrate for reasons other than employment expect to find a job in the place where they will settle. It is fundamental to have an institutional framework that facilitates integration of immigrants into the society. For this purpose, it's important to articulate a set of policies that must have specific benefits for migrant workers, with the purpose of developing skills as to link them to decent jobs. What do I mean with that? Decent job is a concept developed by the ILO, and it's about the characteristics that a job must have, like paying fair wages, being in safety conditions, and with access to social rights like health, social security, as well to the right of unionize. The literature on workforce development underscores the need for specific skills development programs for migrant populations, since they face much more adverse conditions than their native-born counterparts. Lack of familiarity with the labor market and limited English proficiency render mainstream programs ineffective. In this sense, it is fundamental to have English language training as well as skills development that takes into consideration the needs of newcomers. In the case of workers' unions, it should be highlighted that many of the training they offer are given in a wide variety of languages. As an example, as I saw in some interviews that I had, construction in New York, specifically in New York City, has a high presence of people from Ecuador, Poland, Russia, and Armenia. And these organizations are given courses about safety at work, as well on how to handle hazardous materials in their own languages, Spanish, Armenian, Russian, and Polish. So another important element is the link that training process must have with the labor market. Finally, the main goal of every workforce development program is to integrate people into the labor market in the best possible conditions. In some cases, it has been seen that nonprofit organizations manage to capture the needs of certain industries and carry out agreements in which migrants are linked to certain workplaces. As for instance, as I saw with Building Skills Partnership, is doing in Southern California with several agreements with companies to find jobs to trained immigrants. Like they are working very closely with airport administrations in LAX, San Diego, and some other cities. On this, let's say, final graph, I synthesize how would it be possible to integrate a platform that allows workers to know and access to different programs that are offered by the multiple organizations identified. One of the problems that I identified in the interviews I had with experts is that there's not too much promotion about the trainings. For this reason, it should be more efficient if all the opportunities can be integrated in a single platform or application, so the immigrants can look into the entire offer and be part of one or more of their benefits. In this sense, the strategy becomes holistic in terms that they will be able to receive support and wrap around services that address the challenges they face, develop skills that are in demand by the labor market, and find a decent job that utilize their skills. Well, that's my participation. These are the sources that I review. So you will find my email in the first slide if you want to see or if you want me to share this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joaquin, very much. Next is Asha Venugopalan. Asha.
Hello, and thank you, Dr. Refke, for the introduction. Today, I will be discussing access to banking systems, loans, and capital to start and maintain immigrant-owned businesses. Now, why is this topic important? It's not just that immigrants contribute to the economy, but that contrary to popular rhetoric, immigrants are job creators. Immigrants are 80%, multiple studies have found this, immigrants are 80% more likely to start businesses and own businesses than native-born populations. The other factor is that the share of immigrant-owned businesses in the US has increased substantially over the past few decades. In '96, immigrants owned about 13% of all the businesses in the US. In 2021, immigrants own almost 3 out of every 10 businesses in the US. Additionally, some of you would have seen this news that a majority, 55% of billion-dollar startups in the US, the unicorns, were founded by immigrants. And lastly, immigrants are integral in reviving declining towns. A lot of towns, especially in the Midwest and even upstate New York, have seen significant population decline as people have moved to major cities for work. Immigrants move into these communities, start businesses, and vastly improve the tax base and improve the local services. Now, most of the discussion that we see in popular media and in a lot of think tanks is about the tech industry. Now, the tech industry is different because the businesses in the tech industry have access to institutional funders, such as the banks. It's easier to get a loan for a cool tech startup. They also have access to equity. Here I'm referring to angel investors, venture capitalists, private equity. But this is not the case for a significant portion of immigrant-owned businesses which fall within the non-tech industry, and this is my focus. The non-tech industries include your local mom and pop stores, the deli stores, immigrant grocery stores. Out here in Long Island, it's also landscaping and construction businesses. These businesses find it difficult to access institutional funders and have to rely on funding from family and friends and alternate sources such as private lenders and even loan sharks. Given this environment, there are institutions and programs in place. For instance, we have the federal and state agencies such as the Federal Small Business Administration. There is the New York Small Business Services. There are a variety of programs and grants within these. There are also community development financial institutions that provide microloans and small loans to small businesses and are quite in touch with what the community needs. There are also public-private partnerships. A good example would be the New York Opportunity Fund last year that brought together the small business services in New York with the City Group and a few CDFIs to provide vital small business loans to tide over the pandemic. But there are still major hurdles, and we can think of them as immigrant hurdles and institutional hurdles. And I'm going to draw on an analogy that one of my interviewees said. It is a funnel with a decreasing amount of capital that's accessible. There are many hurdles, and I will go through a few key parts. First is the documentation hurdle on the immigrant side. There are business and tax documentation problems, and small businesses tend to use the personal accounts for business reasons. And these are common to small businesses in general. But what is key for immigrants is the non-transferability of credit profiles and how difficult it is to develop a credit profile. The second part is linguistic barriers. It's not just knowing English, but it's also about the language of business and finance. Here I'm referring to terms like revenue statements, profit loss statements, business plans. Immigrants have an intuitive sense of entrepreneurship, but might not know the language that is used by banks to talk about businesses. And of course, there are cultural differences in the financial systems across countries. On the institutional front, there is a major problem of awareness. A lot of immigrant entrepreneurs are not aware of, for instance, the small business development centers in New York or the CDFIs. Furthermore, there is a capacity problem. CDFIs often don't have sufficient funds to cater to the vast small business and immigrant entrepreneur population. There's furthermore a linguistic competency problem of, if we just think of New York City, there are hundreds of languages being spoken. How many languages can you possibly cater to and cater to well? Given the hurdles and the institutions in place and the state of affairs, following are my suggestions and policy recommendations. The first part is to create an inclusive financial environment. So far, I've spoken about immigrants as just a big group, but it is not all the same. Undocumented immigrants face further hurdles. The funnel's even smaller for them, to the point that there is not enough capital for them to access. by providing flexible funding to CDFIs and allowing them to cater to undocumented migrants, we can empower immigrant entrepreneurs. We need to seriously think about alternate approaches to credit profiles. Credit profiles don't transfer, and it's not just about a credit score, it's about a credit history. What are the other ways that we can think of helping immigrant entrepreneurs to build a strong credit profile and access institutional funders? The second part is reaching where the immigrants are. A lot of times, a lot of ads and information are in places that immigrants might not usually access. It might be in newspapers, but immigrant communities talk to each other and share information on social media platforms. And this is where we really should reconsider awareness and PR programs. We need to improve the awareness of small business development centers. One of my informants said SBDCs are the best kept secret in New York, and should not be the case. It should be something that every immigrant knows of. And we need to seriously consider creating new partnerships. There are public-private partnerships, but these need to be expanded to include grassroots organizations that know exactly what the immigrants need, connect them with CDFIs and the federal and state agencies. The next part are to create more business incubator centers. Small businesses and immigrant entrepreneurs have similar problems in terms of they need legal advising, financial advising, and immigrants also need information on government services and how to access these grants. So more business incubator centers that involve government agencies would be a huge development in this area. And all of this is to say that we need to consider more empathetic policymaking. To draw on a line that one of my informants, one of my interviewees said, we need to be empathetic. We need to think of who is at the end of the line, consider the realities of the immigrant entrepreneurs and cater to that instead of what we can give. I want to say a big thank you to all my interviewees. It was great information, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Asha. Next is Soshee Shin. Soshee.
Yes, thank you for your introduction, Dr. Refki. Hello, my name is Soshee Shin, and my topic is how to promote cross-sector partnerships to enhance labor market participation of foreign-born residents. Today, other fellows show the importance of credentialing and workforce development and access to banking system for foreign-born. And in this presentation, I want to show how we can best achieve these objectives through cross-sector partnerships, especially my research question consists of two parts. So how are cross-sector partnerships structured? And the second question is what strategies can help us to build sustainable partnerships? So we can see here what the cross-sector partnerships represent collaborations between organizations spanning at least two different social sectors, such as business, government, and nonprofit. So when there is a partnership between business and government, we call it public-private partnerships, and when it is between business and NGOs, it's profit, non-profit partnerships. Cross-sector partnerships entail various forms of collaboration, such as co-organizing programs, or holding regular roundtables, policy dialogues between various actors. And sometimes it's a cooperation between more than two organizations, and we call it as tri-sector partnerships. Then why we need cross-sector partnerships? According to previous literature and based on my interviews, I found that social issues are sometimes very complex, and the scope of social issues intertwine with interest in various fields. Therefore, social issues can be tackled more effectively through collaboration with various actors playing supplementary or complementary roles. Also, through collaboration, organizations can deepen and widen the range of services. Moreover, we can boost the sustainability of services by maximizing and leveraging both human and financial resources across the broader spectrum of society. Lastly, by engaging with various local stakeholders and understanding the unique needs of immigrants in local communities, we can deliver more customized assistance. So I would like to show that the current partnership models that I found based on interviews and literature reviews. So based on interview and literature review, I found 3 models. And the first one is the facilitator model. So in this model, one organization acts as a mediator, and this facilitating organization conducts and ensures communication between organizations sharing similar goals. Also, it offers coaching and manages administrative tasks for program delivery. Some organizations deliver in-house services, but sometimes other organizations provide more indirect services. So example of this model is learning network to share interests, such as networks of NGOs and local government. A specific example is Welcoming America and World University Services. And the second model is cooperative partnership model. Many of partnership I observed fall under this category. Within this framework, organizations perform complementary roles. So for instance, while states provide funding, community-based organizations are tasked with service delivery. Also, when employers share information about labor market needs, community-based organizations coordinate workforce training. Through interviews, I found that local libraries supply community-based organizations and educational opportunity centers with crucial information about what immigrants need, because this is the place that immigrants visit first time when they arrive in this town. And the third model is the collaborative partnership model. So this approach is characterized by collaboration between organizations delivering similar services. So they work together to organize programs to leverage resources. So it can deepen and broaden the scope of services. So such model can be seen as local association serving immigrant or national association of immigrant settlement organization. However, many of my informants noted that due to competition among NGOs offering similar services, there was a lack of this type of partnership which has a collaborative partnership model. And now, I want to share with you the challenges that I found based on my interviews and research. So based on interviews and literature review, I found the challenges in the current practices. So 3 main gaps emerge in current practices. The first one is that organizations offering similar services often compete, which can inhibit cross-sector partnerships. A significant challenges lies in establishing trust between employers and workforce agencies. Also, finally, the misinformation about immigrant skill make this trust even harder. So it's important to tackle misinformation about immigrants and the skill that immigrant has. So now I would like to share the policy recommendation to address these challenges. So first, promote collaborative funding approaches. For example, if the state supports the joint development of workforce program by community-based organization from the funding structure, rather than selecting a few organizations will focus more on collaboration than competition. Second, strengthen inter-organizational communication. By bringing in communication experts, we can effectively bridge the existing communication gaps between organizations. I received feedback that certain misconceptions, such as doubts about qualification of immigrants, still exist among some employers. So with the right communication strategies, we can reshape these narratives and champion a workforce that truly values diversity. Finally, convene an annual regional summit, specifically organizing a state-supported yearly gathering of local stakeholders, including libraries, community organizations, colleges, and businesses, can foster partnership. Such gathering can be more than just meeting. They can be platform for idea exchange, joint problem solving, and building enduring partnerships. That's all for my presentation today. Thank you for your attention.
Soshee, thank you. Finally, last but not least, is Tsveta Dobreva. Tsveta.
Thank you, Dr. Refki, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to be able to share my research and recommendations with everyone. My name is Tsveta, and the topic I have been doing research on is the role of higher education institutions in supporting refugees and immigrants. So a little more specifically, my research question has been, what is the role of higher education institutions in providing education, wraparound services, and support to refugees and immigrants? And before diving into specifics about the support offered by institutions, I would like to just briefly talk about why supporting immigrant background students' access to college education and professional jobs matters. So if you look at the top left, currently almost 1/3 of all higher education students are immigrants or children of immigrants. And even more importantly, their share of the student population is rapidly increasing. So from 1/5 of all students about 20 years ago, they currently are 1/3 today. And for a few states, their share of the student population is even higher. And in New York, for example, they make up almost half of all students. Looking at the last chart, an important subpopulation of students is undocumented students, who currently represent about 2% of the total student body across the US. Their share of the total enrollment in college has dropped by half in just a few years, which raises important questions about the barriers they face in accessing education. So despite their significant and growing numbers of the student population, immigrant background students face numerous barriers in accessing education, and institutions also face barriers in supporting those students. So on the student side, a major barrier is lack of awareness and information about how to apply and access universities, especially for undocumented and refugee young adults. Some of the other most frequent barriers students face are financial need, family obligations, and the need to work, as well as mental health. Higher education institutions also face barriers in supporting these students. University staff and faculty often lack awareness about the challenges these students face, and they often need more information about how to support them. Other major barriers may include lack of support from leadership, not having adequate funding, and dealing with limiting state and federal policies. Based on the literature and current practices and policies, I categorized higher education programs supporting immigrant background students into 3 models. Any of these models could include programs at a single institution, at a larger organization working with many institutions, or government policies. So under the first one, the access and right to education model, the major goal is making it possible for immigrants and refugees to enroll in college or another educational program. And some examples of this model include in-state tuition policies for undocumented students, or scholarships to make it possible for students to enroll. Programs under the second model, the human capital and labor market model, focus on the immigrants and refugees' potential as workers. The focus here is really on offering programs with a very specific career path as the goal. And examples of this model are recertification programs for immigrant professionals or work training programs. And lastly, programs under the third model, the holistic model, support immigrants and refugees beyond enrollment. Such programs offer non-academic support to cover basic needs such as food or housing insecurity, legal and career counseling, social and mental health support. Their focus is really on supporting students throughout their entire academic path until graduation, because they recognize that many of the barriers immigrant background students face on their path to graduation are not necessarily strictly academic ones. And so taking a look at these three models, I found in my research that programs and policies under the holistic model offer the strongest support for students and make the biggest impact on their academic and professional development. That being said, I just want to emphasize that programs and policies falling under the first two models are a great initial step in supporting immigrant background students, but offering holistic support has the highest impact in the long term. Moving on to my recommendations, what I found was that there are multiple policies that can help remove or at least mitigate some of the barriers that students and practitioners face. On the institutional level, there should be training and advocacy to increase awareness among administration, faculty, and staff. There should be increased emphasis on tailored services for subgroups. There should be flexibility in academic and non-academic policies and programs, and there should be more cooperation and more standardized work across institutions. At the state level, there are some policy recommendations that apply to all subgroups of students. For example, funding non-academic support, such as in cases of food and housing insecurity, as well as covering legal fees for students, would greatly benefit refugee and undocumented students, as well as any low-income immigrant background student. But there are also some recommendations specific to certain subgroups. For example, extending in-state tuition and state aid to undocumented students in all states, as well as making in-state tuition and state aid dependent on residency rather than education. For refugees, allowing non-students, such as refugee families, to live on college campuses, which is currently banned in some states, can expand the scope of how universities can support that population. And for immigrant professionals who seek to recertify, flexibility in relicensing procedures, for example, in respect to tests of English language proficiency, will facilitate the process for many of them. And at the federal level, there are three policy recommendations that I'd like to highlight. Immigration reform, offering path to permanent residency and citizenship for undocumented populations, federal financial aid for undocumented students, and simplification of the language used in FAFSA. In conclusion, immigrants and refugees face many challenges in accessing and completing higher education and participating meaningfully in the workforce. Some institutions and some states are already increasing their support, but there is much more that can be done to support immigrants, refugees, and undocumented populations to fully develop their potential in achieving their educational and professional aspirations. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all university representatives who took time from their busy schedules to talk to me. And I know I briefly touched on many things, so please let me know if you have any questions for me in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Tsveta, and thank you all, fellows. This is incredibly rich information that you collected and analyzed and synthesized in such a short amount of time, only 3 months. So that gives you an idea of the quality of these scholars. So now we start our moderated session. We have a few questions that we will direct to each of our presenters, and then we will open it up for Q&A. We only will accept questions that are typed in the chat. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and we will try to address them in the remaining time that we have. So Ken, first, you discussed credentialing, licensing, and certification of foreign obtained degrees. And so you brought up the notion of treaties or agreements between governments to recognize professional credentials of their citizens. And it's a very innovative idea. Is there a role for international organizations, umbrella organizations, for example, like the United Nations, in standardizing these agreements, harmonizing the educational professional credentials across borders? Is there any treaty or agreement currently in the works along these lines?
Yes, thank you for the question. So there's good news and bad news. I can give the good news first. There is a treaty that's being worked on currently, and it's actually under the umbrella of UNESCO. It's called the Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications Concerning Higher Education. It's the first global treaty that is attempting to mutually recognize tertiary education among countries. It actually just entered into force this year, this past March. The bad news is it's still only 22 countries that have ratified it. And as you know, even if you ratify a treaty, it doesn't necessarily get implemented immediately. And there's all kinds of challenges around that, which is why I think you see a lot of ad hoc agreements. But yes, ideally, more countries would find ways to come to agreements. I do think that, as education continues to be globalized, you are going to see more recognition of universities in the so-called global South, being recognized as having standards on par with those in, industrialized global North countries. So it's also a need to change norms and perceptions. And hopefully this UNESCO treaty will kind of, lay the groundwork for that. So yes, there's good news and bad news around that. But again, this is very new. It just started a few months ago.
Yeah, the world is certainly shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller with the concept of globalization of education for sure.
But Ken, I have a follow-up on that. Of the 22 countries, are the big industrialized countries members or not?
Yeah, good question.
I'll need to look that up. I don't have the list of countries in front of me. But I think offhand there might be a few, but yes, getting more buy-in from the industrialized global North countries is going to be key. And I think that's really the difficulty here, is having them see that, universities in global South countries, they do produce, similar levels of education. I can find that list for you if you like.
Well, what about the US, for example, would be the first one, right? So I think, if the US did it, I think a lot of the other countries would follow suit. So, I think it's an interesting question.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we can get a list of those countries, that would be really cool. So, Ken, another question for you. The numbers tell us that we have labor shortages, that our population is aging, and that we need skilled labor in some key fields, such as, for example, healthcare and STEM. So as you mentioned, there's a bill in New York State legislature titled Empire State Licensing Act that, for example, would lift the citizenship requirements for certain regulated fields, would certainly allow us to capture some of those skills that we need and address some of the shortages. What are some of the reasons to the opposition of this bill? You mentioned protectionism, and can you elaborate a little bit on this, on the resistance that we're facing in this area?
Certainly. Yeah, so I think a lot of it also comes down to the idea that, there could be sensitive information or certain types of technologies that need to be protected, and also that certain standards need to be maintained. And this kind of ties into the question around, are people educated in countries where universities may not be as well funded, or the perception is that people who are trained in those universities their knowledge base is really contextual to that country, right? And it doesn't transport as well to other, including the U.S. There is still definitely, a lot of people who think that. And you mentioned the Empire State Licensing Act. Yeah, the opposition that I understand has, come from, regulatory agencies that worry that if you open it up to non-citizens, it creates all kinds of room for, sensitive information to basically be leaked, and for those who might not be, necessarily qualified to then, be put in positions where they're not able to enforce certain standards. So it is definitely a question of perception, and I think that it is kind of, we, as you've mentioned at the top, we're in the situation where we have an increased number of migrants coming to New York State. This is a time to show that, crisis can be an opportunity, and that many people who are coming do bring a lot of skills with them, and that, having too many requirements, including citizenship requirements and legal status, it's counterproductive in that sense. And other states have already done this. So this is not a novel idea. It is just trying to, basically frame and change the narrative to show that the issue is not so much about, worry about security or these standards, but that you're really filling a labor shortage and a need, and you can do so immediately.
Yep. Thank you, Ken. So Joaquin, you talked to us about workforce development programs and had a really great recommendation of having that holistic approach that you provided to workforce development. Can you elaborate a little bit on your recommendations of having a holistic approach to workforce development of immigrants?
Yes, for sure. That's a great question, Dr. Rifki. I'm talking about a holistic approach because we have different, let's say, institutions that are providing workforce development. We have the government from one side, which is providing technical education through community colleges, universities. We have state programs in New York State and New York City, but we also have nonprofit organizations like Building Skills Partnership, the Maria Macesa Fund, for example, who is funding like 90 organizations around the country. But we also have specific programs that are doing the firms to develop skills between their workers and the workers' unions. So when we say that we need to provide a holistic strategy, we need to take some elements of every of these three main institutions, and we can have like an institutional platform in which the workers can be able to know the offer to take English courses, to take courses related to what they or where they want to work, etc. That's what I mean with a holistic approach.
And definitely you're touching on a very important point that we have a really, really fragmented system, and services that are, or regions and areas where we have duplication of services and a lot more services than we need, and other areas where we don't have services. So we need to really also provide that holistic approach geographically as well as, programmatically. And address the needs of immigrants at every juncture of their journey here in this country. When they arrive, continue to provide the workforce development when they have the jobs, and continue after job placement as well. Very important point. Another question for you, Joaquin, is to talk to us a little bit about that model of learn and earn apprenticeships programs. They've been touted as really a very responsive model of workforce development that is also tailored to migrants, because we know that the financial need is great when you immigrate and you need to provide, provide for a family and have financial obligations. So learn and earn apprenticeship programs that also integrate ESL and profession-specific language skills, it seemed to be a really, really good model. Can you talk a little bit about that model where that you found in your research, and tell us how we can, scale it up or replicate it?
Yeah, for sure. These are very interesting type of models, the learn and earn apprenticeship. We do have a learn and earn apprenticeship program in New York City, and I'm a supporter and believer of apprenticeship. They are tested. They work in Mexico, which is my home country, and there are several examples, I believe, around the world. It is a program in which people is going to a company, they receive some kind of wage for let's say it can be 3 months, 6 months, whatever. It depends on the program. The only thing that I see that is probably or it's an area of strength is that many of these programs are focused on persons that have employment authorizations in the US. So probably one idea that we can put in practice is to expand these benefits to the people that probably do not have legal documents, and not just for the people who have green cards and the other type of visas.
Absolutely, Joaquin, absolutely. And so we need them and they need us, right? It works both ways. So, and there are a number of undocumented, large number of undocumented residents, New Yorkers, who may benefit from this. And we can leverage, really provide a path to citizenship and to their, documentation. Was there any?
One more thing that I will add is that these programs are great because you get in touch with the employer. They know you, and if you like them, they will offer a job. So it's the easiest way to locate someone in a workplace.
Yeah, and maybe the entry point is the community college as well. If they're connected to a community college and in a program in a community college that places them with employers who have this program jointly, talking about partnerships, that can be a win-win situation.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Joaquin. So we move on to Asha. And Asha, you talked to us about access to banking systems, loans, and capital to start and maintain immigrant-owned businesses. And you used a terminology that was interesting, empathetic policymaking. What do you exactly mean by that? And why is it important to make it happen?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Refke. When I was talking to a bilingual business advisor at an SBDC, this was the term she used. She said, we need more empathy. And while I'm going through a lot of interviews, it's the same underlying notion that's coming. For instance, when there is a government grant or like a public-private partnership grant that is out there, and New York State very clearly does not discriminate on immigration status, which is great. But the discrimination and the hurdles really come in when it gets to the documentary part. So at that point, it's a clear distinction. If you're undocumented, you're unable to produce certain documents that are necessary for your businesses, or some documentation requirements in terms of taxation or the tax years are just simply unrealistic for a small business. So it's a lack of empathy in terms of not understanding where these businesses are and to reach them where they need to be. Another part that comes in is in terms of childcare. A lot of immigrant entrepreneurs, especially women and immigrant entrepreneurs, need the support system, need the society to come together and help them through the form of childcare or elderly support that allows them to access all of these different institutions. So empathetic policymaking for me is, it is one thing for the government and the institutions to say, we've done what we can without quite understanding what is actually needed in the ground. And we will not understand it until we reach out to these grassroots organizations who are well aware of the problems.
Yeah, and understanding that also, the impact that these businesses can have on the community. So it's a two-way street. We really need these businesses. And how can policymaking really keep up with the economic needs, as well as, walking in the shoes of understanding the perspectives of people who are creating those businesses and the challenges that they face. So, so that's great. Asha, another question. You talked about the one-stop shop, and many of you talked about that as really a good model. Because in one place you can access many services, which makes it really easier. So my question to you, how can, and we definitely have that model that exists of a one-stop shop, how can a mainstream model of a one-stop shop integrate the needs of immigrants in its structure and its design so that we avoid a phenomena that we always see, that immigrant considerations are really an afterthought or an add-on. And when you're facing pressures such as the pandemic or even just staffing turnover, that's the one thing that goes out the window, because it's really not integrated in the structure of the design of the program. So how can those mainstream models of the one-stop shop integrate the needs of immigrants in their structure and its design so that it's sustained there?
Absolutely, it's a great question. I think it's fundamentally about the institutions that are brought together at this one-stop shop. As you mentioned, business incubator centers are hugely successful, but most of the incubator centers I've seen often cater to the tech industry, tech startups, but not really to the small businesses, the mom and pop stores. So one part of it is a space where people can come in and have business advisory, but another part of it is to have a government representative, to have a government agency involved in this, so that there is also, I think one way to sustain it is to have a transference of information. This one-stop shop recognizes that these are the gaps that certain groups face. Immigrants face these problems. Instead of just holding on to that information, if there's a government agency, it gets passed on. And the government agencies then become involved and become integral to the support that is given to small businesses and immigrant entrepreneurs. Another way to ensure that immigrants are also focused, is also a target audience in business incubators, would be to involve grassroots immigrant organizations that do exist, especially in New York City. There are so many, and they are very well aware of what can be realistically produced by immigrant entrepreneurs. Certain documentations, it's just not possible. And especially undocumented immigrants get worried when they're asked about the immigrant status. So it is a gap. It is a difficult problem to solve, but I think it comes down to empathetic policymaking by involving multiple organizations, bringing them all together in one place, having a representative from different places. I think that is one approach to making sure immigrants are well catered to.
Asha, thank you so much, because you're providing us a segue into partnerships and cross-sector partnerships with which Soshee has studied. And a question for Soshee is, really, what are the best practices in cross-sector partnerships? Is there a model that you point to and you say you believe that this model effectively tries to address all the challenges of cross-sector partnerships in immigrant workforce development? You talked to us about several models. Is there one model that you think really theoretically addresses the challenges that are cited in the literature?
Yes, thank you for your question, Dr. Refki. I think that's really an important question. So in my opinion, to address the best practices in cross-sector partnership, I would highlight the complementary model I mentioned earlier. So it doesn't mean that other models are not important, but because other models play also different roles to maintain different types of partnership. But in my opinion, cooperative model could enhance the effectiveness and sustainability and the relevance of services to immigrants. Because when I talk to my interviewees and also other people engaging in community-based organization, I really found a practical example for this cooperative model cooperative model which could be very sustainable. I can give you a concrete example of this case. So the one of the interesting, enlightening example was the role of local libraries in the community. So local libraries often serve as an initial stop for immigrants to gather local information and network. And since these libraries are tuned into immigrants' needs, their collaboration with Educational Opportunity Center was particularly very synergistic. So the Education Opportunity Center can create workforce programs based on insights from these libraries. Also, libraries can provide spaces for language and workforce training. So this partnership enables libraries to further their mission of local inclusion, while Educational Opportunity Center can deliver more tailored programs to immigrants.
Great, thank you, Soshee. I'm really intrigued by the idea of competition between organizations. And it's a feature in the US service system that we see all the time. The tendency to create new organizations rather than really strengthen existing infrastructure. So we end up with a situation where we have a lot of organizations in one area that are doing the same thing. And what you're saying is we need to bring these organizations together in collaborative partnerships, in cooperative and collaborative partnerships, so that they work together and not duplicate services. But also we have areas where there are very severely absent organizations and infrastructure. So thank you for the work you've done on this. The idea of trust also and building trust is important. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on how you build trust? And obviously the top-down approach with funders requiring collaborations is a welcome step, but how can trust evolve organically from the bottom up? Do you have any insights on that?
Yes, thank you for your question. I really thought about how to build trust to promote cross-sector partnership, and I think that the mutually beneficial relationship could really promote trust building. So I learned I met an organization which offer workforce development not only for foreign-born residents but also for general employees. And over the years, they've built a trusted relationship with employers by consistently providing workforce trainings. And because of this kind of long history of trust and mutual exchange, the exchange for employers was the workforce training for their employees, and the benefits for the workforce development was like their reputation and their recognition in terms of their ability to provide proper workforce training. So because of this mutually beneficial relationship and long history of trust, when the workforce development recommend immigrants for jobs, employers are more confident in the candidates' abilities. So it could also tackle the misinformation about immigrants' qualification, and also it could tackle the trust issue between employers and workforce development agencies. So I think such this kind of this trust and the long history of exchange could be a win-win relationship which can strengthen collaborative advantages.
Thank you, Sohee. I think it's really important also to realize that partnerships take time, and it takes effort, and it takes dedicated staff. It cannot be something that you do on the side, but it has to be really part of your everyday work, nurturing and cultivating these partnerships through your work. Thank you for your work on that. And so finally, my questions to Tsveta. Tsveta, you talked about streamlining the FAFSA process, the financial aid applications, and you proposed it as a strategy for increasing access to immigrants in higher education. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Thank you very much for this question. So when it comes to FAFSA, there are really two things which came up in conversations with staff at colleges and universities. And so a big one is that filling out the FAFSA, of course, is an important way that students who may be eligible for aid can ultimately get help in accessing education. But in a way, FAFSA is also a barrier to accessing education for immigrant families and immigrant background students. So one great first step to make the process of filling FAFSA out a little easier would be to make funding more available for multilingual hotlines that can assist immigrant families with the process, which could be at the state level, as that may better reach specific populations. And currently, the availability of such language support through hotlines or any sort of translation assistance is very inconsistent from state to state and language to language. But an even larger issue with FAFSA that again was mentioned by several practitioners was that its language itself is very bureaucratic, which makes it unnecessarily confusing and complicated. And so again, what was emphasized was that even with a translator to assist you, it is still a difficult application to navigate. So if there could be a change on the federal level to remove some of that bureaucratic layer of language in FAFSA, it would make that process a lot more accessible to a much bigger range of people.
Thank you for that, Tsveta. So can you tell us about a model that you think would effectively address the challenges that immigrants are facing in accessing higher education? A model that would be considered as a best practice because it leverages the institutional role of higher education institutions in the economic and social integration of immigrants. Is there that model?
The closest to such a model would be the holistic model because it both focuses on giving students access, getting them in the door, and supporting them with scholarships, with in-state tuition policies. It helps them access higher education, but it also offers non-academic support, which is really crucial for immigrant background students, for refugee students, for undocumented students, for immigrant professionals. There are a large variety of non-academic needs, which most of the time, if students don't complete their education, it's because of those non-academic needs, not because of any significant difficulties with academics. So any university program which has a dedicated office to work with a specific subpopulation, which has funding available for covering non-academic needs, which offers social support as well, is really ensuring as best as it can that immigrant background students will successfully graduate and will successfully contribute to the workforce.
And that is a very important lesson. And many institutions are now really offering some of this. Community colleges are doing a lot better than large universities. But also we come back to the idea that immigrant students may not know, may not have the information that these services exist, because they come from very different, landscape, and may not realize that the services exist to help them. But the idea that you need to address those determinants of social determinants of success if you want to see successful students is very important, whether these are housing, food insecurity, or mental health. But you also need to outreach proactively and deliberately to these students who may not know that they have these services and can access it and they are entitled to it. Thank you so much, Tsveta. And so we reached the end of our moderated segment. And now we would like to open it up to the floor, questions from the floor. And I believe Rachel has put together some of the questions that came in the chat. Rachel? So I do not see any in the chat, and I know okay, so one question that came in, 47% of 47% of students in New York State, immigrants or children of immigrants, correct? Do you think that New York State legislators or New York State Department of Education staff operate with this understanding of our college and university populations? That's a good question. Tsveta, do you have an answer to that?
So there are some promising things I'm seeing and still some gaps. So one promising act, which Ken also mentioned, is the Empire State Licensing Act of 2024, which will, if it passes, it will directly benefit undocumented students who will be able to, after obtaining a degree in a certain field, be able to access a certification and practice their profession, which currently is not possible for this population. So that's one promising sign I'm seeing. But in terms of, for example, access to in-state tuition in New York State, I would say there is still a lot that can be done to, again, for undocumented students, make college possible and much more possible, because the way it currently, the way in-state tuition currently works in New York State is that it's the eligibility for it is based on education rather than residency. And what that does for especially recent undocumented young adults, recently arrived undocumented young adults, is that many times they need just one semester of high school or even a year and a half, but the eligibility criteria states that they need at least 2 years of high school education in the state of New York to qualify for in-state tuition. But again, for those who arrived in the very last minute of high school, that didn't happen. So they are effectively barred forever from accessing in-state tuition, which for the vast majority of them is a really heavy burden. So that is a very, I would say, important area, which I would recommend New York State legislator, look at and work on.
Yep, thank you, Tsveta. It's really, again, empathetic policymaking, borrowing from Asha's term, and understanding that the economic realities mandate flexibility in how we address the issues, that one size may not fit all. So another question that came in the chat is growing anti-immigrant sentiments, particularly to new immigrants and undocumented immigrants in cities, suburbs, and rural communities in New York challenges the implementation of the important policy recommendations you describe. What role can our group and your research play in confronting these fears and opposition to immigrants and their integration into the economic, social, and educational life of New York? Anybody can answer that. We all talked about, the anti-immigrant sentiments, the protectionist attitudes, and how it can stifle some of these approaches, which may be, productive from a policy perspective, from an economic perspective, but it does not have the political support to move forward. Ken, Asha, go ahead.
So sorry, Ken can go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Asha.
The one point that comes to mind is the first thing I said in my presentation is that immigrants are job creators. And I think that is lost in popular rhetoric. And often I think it is up to academics and research institutions to make that awareness campaign, that we have a lot of research that show how much immigrants contribute to society, makes it more diverse, revives dying towns. And I think we lose out on that rhetoric. And that's a narrative that not just research think tanks, but that's something we need to be pushing out into mainstream media and say that, no, there are other things that are also happening. And so I think that really stuck with me when I saw the percentage differences.
Absolutely. We have to continue to tell the story. Anybody else want to weigh in?
Someone who was just trying to help people deal with this issue on a daily basis. I think part of it is not just kind of recognizing the problem, but I think and I think some of you alluded to this, many of you in your presentations. What are the practical things we could do to make the system work more efficiently? I think often we all know this, right? People are frightened of these situations where, a busload of people show up in Chautauqua, New York with 100 people, and they say, these folks are part of your community now. Are there, opportunities for those folks as soon as they get there, if the process of getting them recognized and jobs available? Yes. I think what's been proved over the past year is at least that much, that folks will be assimilated into society, but we've set up enormous barriers for that to happen quickly and efficiently. And that doesn't mean we ignore those, but I think we have to constantly look for ways to make it work faster, to provide the kinds of supports that people need, especially families. I think the issue that most people, and I'm going to shut up in a second, don't realize right now is how much of the current migrant crisis that we're facing is actually families and not just single men. And so I think that that's another thing that I think people would be much more open to helping families integrate into society more quickly. But believe me, we're going to be facing significant issues. We're getting towards the beginning of the school year. These folks are going to be enrolling their kids into local school districts. All of the same kind of fear and worry, and do we have enough money to pay for it at the local government level? All those things are going to be happening right now. So I think looking for ways to ease the burden at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, I think is going to be critical. Just me.
Yes, and with that, Bob, that's points very well taken. People are afraid, resources are being stretched, and a part of it is that we don't have plans. We don't have plans in place, and to make sure that people are absorbed productively without straining the system. So we are out of time. So again, our presentations today examined model programs that address foreign-born Americans and the challenges they face, that provide credential recognition, retraining education, and access to capital to build thriving immigrant-owned businesses. You all examined the role of government, higher educational institutions, and the nonprofit sector, and the role of cross-sector partnerships in deepening and broadening the reach of these programs. And maybe some of the answers will lie into really bringing more coordination to a fragmented system and more communication amongst local government. And so one thing remains for sure, that we know how to fix systems as Americans, and as nonprofit or public or private sector actors, we can intervene to harness that power of immigrants' economic contributions. We have two strategic approach that we recognize as viable to advance this goal. The first approach is really to mainstream and integrate immigrant-specific considerations in existing systems, existing programs and services that are designed for native-born populations, so that these programs can proactively address these unique challenges facing the population. And the second approach is to really create tailored programs and services that are designed specifically for the immigrant population. We might need one or both approaches in certain areas, depending on what we're dealing with. And we know that without these approaches, we'll continue to experience that brain waste and loss of economic potential. We will continue to experience the fear, the anxiety of the resources being stretched, being really reactionary. We have reactionary responses to emergency situations like this. So as we heard during the presentations, there is really a dire need to outreach to immigrants, to improve access to information. There's also a need to reform that existing system, so there is better coordination, less fragmentation, more streamlining, more simplification, and more linguistically and culturally responsive processes and procedures. There is a need to recognize the unique challenges facing this population as prospective employees with underutilized skills often and talents, prospective students, prospective entrepreneurs, but there's also an urgent need to shift perspectives from a deficit lens to viewing newcomers not as burden on institutions, but recognizing that we can, again, borrowing from Ken's terminology or statement, we can turn challenges to opportunities. We've done it many, many times as Americans. Recognize that they really can bring significant assets that can be mobilized to reverse the stagnant demographic and economic trends that we are expecting, increase economic productivity, and address workforce shortages. This can also help us really win the global war on talent. Thank you for joining us today during this very important discussion. We would like to thank Secretary Rodriguez for his inspiring remarks, Bob Magna, Director of the Rockefeller Institute of Government, for his leadership and support of the Institute's work, and really your valuable contribution to the discussions in this webinar. I would also like to thank the fellows on immigrant integration for their work, which will inform the discourse on the issues. I also would like to tell you all that there will be written products as well as events that will be held in the fall and the spring that will be continuation of this work. So stay tuned to information from all of us about upcoming products and events. I would also like to thank Guillermo Martinez, Deputy Director of the Institute, for his tireless work with the fellows, one-on-one and in group, for his guidance of the fellows' research and his careful review and advice on their work and connections that he provided to informants, to leaders who really talked with the fellows and give them an in-depth perspectives on what's happening on the front line. Finally, we're also grateful to the Board of Directors, the Board of Advisors who guide the Institute's work. We urge you to visit the Institute's website to learn more about the work and the work of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. And with that, we will end the webinar. We look forward to seeing you in future Institute's event. Take care, everybody.